Hey, Legacy High School, my name is Mr. Boring, and I'm going to be giving you a very brief background information lecture about the civil rights movement that takes place mainly in the 1960s. The purpose of this lecture is to give you some of the major events that led up to that civil rights movement, as well as some of the key people and events that shaped the civil rights movement in the United States of America. So without any fanfare or anything like that, let's just hop right into this thing and talk about some of the events that you've already learned about that influenced the civil rights movement. Now, starting in the post-Civil War era, the Reconstruction era, there was the creation and ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment reversed the Dred Scott decision, created the due process and equal protection clauses within the Constitution, and created birthright citizenship. The main purpose of the 14th Amendment really was to create an equal playing field for all Americans, but especially freed slaves and African Americans who had been second-class citizens at best prior to the Civil War. The 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights for all races. In the vein of equal opportunity, the belief is that if African Americans could vote, they would in all likelihood vote for African American candidates who would then in turn bring an African American perspective to the halls of Congress and to the national governments and state governments that existed during that time period and create even more opportunity and equality for Americans. Unfortunately, there wasn't really an enforcement arm for any of these amendments, and so they ultimately fail to achieve the outcome that many of the framers of these amendments had hoped for. And we can see that best in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, which establishes the system of separate but equal. That in turn will create a system of de facto and de jure racism. Now remember, de facto racism is racism outside of the purview of government. It's just racism that people have, right? Think about like a racist individual. Now de jure racism is racism under government influence. Think about black codes during this time period, right? So de facto would be more KKK and Jim Crow, and de jure would be more of the black codes and enforcement arm of black only, white only separations of people. Now, in the 1920s, after the First World War, many African Americans citizens of the South had had enough of this system and migrated north. And you learned about this Great Migration. The Great Migration takes many African American citizens out of the Deep South and sends them to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Mainly these cities become the population meccas for many of the African American citizens on the move because they have job opportunities, right? In the auto industry, in the meat packing industry, or New York, which was then and remains today really the hub of American culture and commerce. Now, the Great Migration also exposed many northern white citizens to what might be termed black culture. Think about jazz music. Think about the cultural patterns surrounding food, surrounding gatherings of people, but mainly music. And the heart of this was in Harlem. At the same time, you start to see people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois who are starting to agitate more for a black identity and more of an understanding of the contributions of African American people towards American society. So the Great Migration really starts to push African American culture out of the Deep South, where it had remained largely due to slavery patterns that existed prior to the Civil War, and starts to expose more Americans to African American culture. One of the key kickers, though, that really jumpstarts the civil rights movement is the Second World War. And we've already learned a lot about some of the early desegregation efforts of President Harry Truman, who desegregates the military in Executive Order 9981. We know that many of the southern states pushed back against these efforts. Very famously, there's the creation of the Dixiecrat Party, which were Democrats who felt that starting to create desegregation and an equal playing field for African Americans was against the patterns of the Democratic Party. But really, due in large part to World War II, we start to see a shift away from the traditional segregation patterns that had been in place for roughly 50 to 70 years, and more of an understanding that there needed to be more equality. And then the kicker occurs in 1954 when Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer for the NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, wins a landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which finds that discrimination, that Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is inherently unequal, and that there needs to be more of an integrated system. And that really kicks off the civil rights movement. Now, if we go back in time a little bit, one of the things that we need to understand is that the 1950s, the civil rights movement didn't just crop up on its own. There had been massive amounts of contributions and changing attitudes that really kicked off in 1941, 1942, again, due in large part to World War II. So after the First World War, we saw that many African Americans had been hopeful for more of an equal footing in American society. Many of the soldiers and doughboys who had gone over to France had been viewed as heroes. They come back to the United States and they're still second-class citizens. Very famously, we'll have race riots in Chicago and the race massacre in Tulsa, where former African-American soldiers will actually attempt to fight back against their white tormentors, leading to the death of possibly 300 people and literally machine gun battles in the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it becomes pretty clear to civil rights movements and agitators after the 1920s race riots that fighting for civil rights couldn't be actually literally fighting. You needed to have more of a legislative grassroots sort of push. And one of those key leaders was A. Philip Randolph. Now, his belief was in the double V system, or double V for victory at home, victory against the fascists, as a way of elevating African American status. And he forges a crucial ally, or really didn't have to forge that hard because Eleanor Roosevelt was already a champion of equal rights and equality within society. But there's a strong link between the Roosevelt administration, particularly Eleanor Roosevelt, and Randolph, in creating more of an equal opportunity for African Americans, right? Because of this, we see Executive Order 8802, which basically prohibits segregation in any sort of war industry related industry or production area. So think about all the tanks and ships and airplanes that needed to be built. We see the integration of the armed services. We spoke in class extensively about the contributions of African American soldiers on the battlefield, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the overall just like forward facing outlook of African Americans during this time period in terms of being meaningful contributors to the war effort. And in so doing, this helps elevate the status. And one of the key lessons that comes out of this is that there can be more to be gained through a legal framework than there can be gained through an actual physical fighting framework. So the civil rights movement of the late 1940s, early 1950s takes on this flavor of legal and social agitation as opposed to violent political revolution. Now, one of the things that really kickstarts the movement in terms of a national exposure to the plight of African Americans, particularly in the Deep South, is the murder of Emmett Till. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a heavy subject matter, but it's something that we do need to get into. Now, Emmett Till was a boy from the North. His family had participated in the Great Migration, and he had gone down to the South to visit family. Now, as the story goes, and this is highly suspect because the people telling this story of the people who are ultimately going to be implicated in Emmett Till's murder. Emmett Till goes down to the South. He's whistling at white women. He's whistling at white girls. He's staring. He's breaking these sort of Southern sensibility, unspoken de facto racism rules. And as a result of this, Emmett Till's taken out into a swampy area. He's beaten to death. This is a young boy. He's beaten to death, and his body is weighted down into this Martian bog. He disappears. It's found later, and he will become a symbol for the civil rights movement, right? At the same time as Emmett Till's murder, you also will have some key landmark events like the Montgomery bus boycott. You'll have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. creating the Southern Southern Christian Leadership Conference to start to take the nonviolence movements of Mahatma Gandhi and transport them into the United States and create an organizational framework. We'll start to see the application of some of the Brown decision mandates that were laid down by the Supreme Court and the integration of schools. But Emmett Till really can be seen as a trip point because his brutal murder leads to a more of a national recognition of a system of unequal protections under the law and unfair treatment, to say the least, for African Americans. Right? And the photos of Emmett Till that you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner are shocking. His body had decomposed in the bog. His mother very famously said she wanted an open casket funeral so that the world could see what had happened to her beautiful little boy in terms of the mutilation of his body. And this really shocks the American public into understanding that something really needs to change. But remember, there's this real strong belief that the movement needs to be a non-violent movement, that violent overthrow will not create the sort of change that many African Americans and sympathetic white citizens felt was necessary during this time period. So with that, we see the creation of the nonviolent resistance classes that are taught by Reverend James Lawson, who really starts to push the population into into an awkward moment. He does this through the creation of sit-ins. These become championed by not just Martin Luther King, but the SCLC and other civil rights activists, because what it forced the white establishment, whether they be police officers or whether they're citizens, again, de facto or de jure, elements of the racist system at play here, forced the oppressor to become the violent actor and not the oppressed. And what that starts to do is it starts to create this imagery. And a lot of the imagery of the time period will show you peaceful protesters or advocates being attacked by dogs, sprayed by fire hoses, horses moving through the crowds. Famously, at some of the marches at Selma, you'll see a posse ride into the crowd and attack peaceful marchers and protesters. But what does this do? It creates more sympathy. It creates a greater understanding that what is being agitated for from the civil rights leaders' perspectives is this basic human freedoms under the Constitution, under a moral ethical framework. And what's taking place to oppress that is really violent and untoward, right? The reaction doesn't equal the action, right? And so what happens? We start to see a lot more sympathy, right? And these clashes will become very, very violent. Like I said, very famously, you'll see in Alabama and in Mississippi, violent clashes between the state and the protesters, the dogs, the fire hoses. You'll also see bombings of black churches. Again, black churches become these organizational centers and hubs. Unfortunately, you'll see children die in these attacks, especially in church bombings. You'll see people thrown in jail. Martin Luther King, very famously, will spend months in jail as a result of some of these clashes. This will culminate in Mississippi Governor George Wallace proclaiming segregation now, segregation forever. But it also creates a space for African Americans to start to elevate their message. And that elevated message starts to occur after some of the violence really tips over, right? And so as we start to see the progression of the civil rights movements into the 1960s, we start to see a movement away from localized regional push for rights and more of a national moment. And this culminates both in the March on Washington, where MLK very famously gives his I Have a Dream speech, but we also see the movement start to coalesce around the assassination of Medgar Evers, and finally leads to civil rights legislation, which takes place in 64 and 65, right? So very famously, you'll have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Congress will use the Commerce Clause to start to desegregate and break up systems of de facto racism in the South, specifically in Alabama. And Earl Warren's Supreme Court, which many believed would be a conservative court, will actually start to untie that really tightly wound ball of rights suppression that had taken place throughout the course of the early 20th century. So when you get into your research, feel free to come back, check out this video. It should provide you some basic context. This is Mr. Boring for the U.S. History Team signing off. Bye.